All right, we good to go? I think we're good. We got a lot. I'll keep letting people in as time goes on, but the longer I wait, the more my cat's gonna try to ruin things. So, hello, welcome everyone. I'm Carl Schultz, and I'm here with Dan Marshall. That's just who I'm here with more people, but we'll get there. We are with the Charter Street Cemetery Welcome Center, and we operate out of the Pickman House, and we basically work with preservation and interpretation of the cemetery space, and just sort of trying to, one, make sure everyone doesn't go and destroy it, which is something an increasing number of people seem to want to do, but also just sort of being able to provide information on the cemetery. So if you want to brave the cold, we are there every day from 12 to 4. We are extremely privileged to be able to introduce this lecture and our guests that we have here today. We have two very special guests. We have Professor Donna Seger, who is the professor of medieval and early modern history at Salem State, and very, very soon, next week, right, has a book coming out.
Yes.
And I'm about to share what that that book looks like. This is not it. There we go. This is bad. I've done a bad job, everyone. This is the book. You can buy it next week.
Yay! Thank you.
And on that same note, this is Tad Baker's book. I'm doing a very bad technical job. I even practiced, and now it has fallen to pieces. Emerson Tad Baker is professor of history at Salem State University, and as I said, his most recent book is A Storm of Witchcraft: The Salem Trials and the American Experience. And his current book explores material life in 17th century New England. And they are both here to discuss Puritan and Protestant death ways. And how we're going to do this is that they are going to present. And if at any point you have a question that you would like to ask them, please send that to Dan and myself in the chat feature. Please don't spam the whole class. That will get really confusing very fast. And then we are going to present those questions at the end. So if you have anything that you would like to ask, feel free to just shoot those. At any point, we'll be checking it pretty consistently. So just send those in the chat to Dan and I. And again, if you have any questions, technical or otherwise, just send those that way. And without further ado, I think I've got all the bullet points. I'm going to turn it over to Donna and Ted. Thank you, guys.
Okay, I am going to start, ladies and gentlemen. Can everybody see that? Is everybody seeing my screen? And I want to say thank you very much to Elizabeth and Carl and Dan at the Charter Street Cemetery Welcome Center. As a Salem resident, I am thrilled that they are stewards of this very important burying ground, because I remember what it was like before they were not stewards of this very important burying ground. So I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you very much for sponsoring our talk. Just to give all of you a heads up, this is going to be a very kind of interesting talk, because Tad and I are going to talk about two very different, we have the same topic, but different approaches into the topic. I am an English historian of the late medieval period and the Renaissance and the Reformation. So I'm pretty much going to enter this topic through theology and spirituality. I'm going to make my way very slowly into the material world, but I'm not going to spend much time there. About the same time I get there, I'm going to kind of hand it over to my colleague, and we're going to jump the pond, and he's going to tell you about the material aspects of this very important topic. But I want to start with theology and with the Reformation. This is a big topic, so I'm intimidated with the challenge of talking about it in 20 or 25 minutes or so. And again, before I start, we're both hoping to run about 25 minutes each, and then we hope there's plenty of time for questions. We actually have questions for each other. So we really do hope that we can have some great discussion with you and with each other. But I will start. The title of my talk is Death in the Reformation, Perceptions and Practice. And because this is a huge topic, I'm really going to focus on two things. One, the separation of the living and the dead, which is a very provocative thing. And two, the separation of the sacred and the secular. So without further ado, I'm going to just sort of jump into this first topic. The Reformation, I am a big believer that the Reformation changed absolutely everything, changed our world. But the Reformation certainly and very prominently changed the relationship between the living and the dead. Now, if you haven't studied this period before, you might be wondering, although maybe you're not because you live in Salem and this is a this is a city where there is kind of a close relationship between the living and the dead. But in the late medieval period, in the pre-Reformation period, there was actually quite a close relationship between the living and the dead. And it was a relationship, as I've written here, that was based on both admonition and obligation. You often see, I've given you an example here on the screen. This is a very, very common genre of late medieval arts called the three living and the three dead. And you have three living people. Sometimes they represent different orders or different classes. Sometimes they're just a bunch of young guys out there riding their horses. Sometimes they're kings and queens. Sometimes, they could be anyway. But they're very much alive and they're going about their business. And suddenly, boom, these three skeletons come out and look at them. And it's like, wow, that's death. That's death. Death is right in front of me. And this was very, very popular genre following the Black Death, when 27 million people died in 5 years between 1347 and 1352. And this sudden, horrible, horrific death just loomed over everybody. The loss, the survivors were haunted by the loss. They were haunted by the very bad deaths of all the people that had died during this pandemic. And then we have to remember that what we call the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century was just the first wave of a pandemic, which became endemic in Europe and really sort of hit every generation. So death is always stalking people, okay? And that's what you see in the three living and the three dead images, which are really everywhere. So that's the warning. And you can interpret the warning in different ways. You can interpret the warning to say, oh, we better get ready. We better lead a good life. We better, be sinless. We better be ready to die. Or you can, if you have more of a Renaissance mentality, you can interpret the three living and the three dead as, oh, death can strike at any time, so I really better seize the day and really live my life. And there are examples of both people, both kind of attitudes to the omnipresent death. So that's varying, but what is not varying is the other relationship between the living and the dead in the late medieval period. And that's the fact that the living have the responsibility to intercede for the dead so that the dead can achieve lasting salvation. Because in late medieval Europe, purgatory looms very, very, very large. Purgatory, which was a concept that was, some might say, invented by the church in the 11th century. Certainly Martin Luther said it was invented by the church in the 11th century. Was kind of a limbo land that souls were sent to after the death of their corporal bodies to pay off their lasting sin. I mean, the premise behind purgatory is that everybody is sinful, and even if you atone and repent throughout your life, you're still going to have some built-up punishment that you need to pay for sin. So some people are going to be in purgatory for 10 years. Some people are going to be in purgatory for 10,000 years, but everybody is going to be in purgatory. And it's the responsibility, literally, it is the responsibility of people in this life, living people, okay, to work, to get people out of purgatory through prayers, through appealing to saints, and then later on through the purchase of indulgences, which were pardons that released one from the time one was consigned to spend in purgatory. So you have a very, almost like a contractual relationship between the living and the dead. And I think it's very burdensome on late medieval people, very burdensome. And also on late medieval people is the burdensome of the fear of sudden death. Sudden death. I really, having, read so many attitudes and so much about the late medieval period in particular, it's very clear to me that the death was not something that your average person feared. It was the idea of sudden death, when you were just, happened upon, as you see here in my image. Again, a beautiful young woman in the beauty of young life, but there's the Grim Reaper right before her. She's going to die and she's not ready. This is sudden death. This is sudden death. She hasn't atoned. She hasn't repented. She's not ready. So in a civilization where the plague was an endemic, I think that the anxiety was very much heightened over this as well. Dying a sudden death, and also a bad death alone with no atonement, no last rites, was everyone's worst fear. So here you have some great images from the 15th century, from the late 15th century. So this is right before the Reformation. And over here on my left is a very good death. This is how death should happen. Okay. And this is a bit, there's also a very kind of practical attitude towards death in the late medieval period. I mean, one of the most famous and common books that were published first in manuscript and later with the new printing press were the Ars Moriendo, the art or craft of dying well. Okay, and this was all the steps that you need to take to die a good death. So here we have the perfect example here. We have the priest, we have the church is there, we have the family is there, we have a monk, there's peaceful, the devil's right there, but you can see that Saint Michael or some angel is swooping in, okay, and there's always a fight between an angel and a demon right at the bedside. People are at their most vulnerable in the hour before their death, that 1 hour, because that's when you get really, really anxious. Even if you've lined everything up perfectly, like this person on the left has done, even if you have all the reinforcements you need, you're still very, very anxious in the hour before your death. The devil can sneak in there. Okay, if you don't keep in charge here and keep your eye on the ball, he can sneak in there and just take you away. And that's exactly what's happening over here on the right-hand side. That is a very bad death. That naked form that the devil's walking away with is that dead person's soul. Okay, he's just ripped it out of his body because there was no one else there to help this person die a good death. Now I'm going to show you just, 2-minute warning here, or 5-second warning right here. I just wanted to put in here, this is my student's favorite example of a really bad death. So here you go. Okay, that is really bad. I mean, no one is helping this poor soul. And the devil is so aggressive. He's reaching in. He's not even waiting. I mean, he's reaching in and dragging that soul off. So, I mean, death is it's really graphic. It's really there. It's omnipresent. And you do feel the burden. You feel this sense of, oh my God, we got to worry about our own sudden deaths and all of our relatives. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. So one would hope that when the Reformation comes and purifies and supposedly simplifies everything, that, it would get less burdensome. I'm not quite sure that's true. We can discuss that. But at least things change in a big way. Okay. The reformers, all the reformers, and again, we really don't have a Protestant Reformation. We have Protestant Reformations, plural. There's no one Protestant church that replaces the Catholic Church. We have different varieties of Protestantism, and I'm going to talk about two specifically here tonight. But in general, all of the reformers believed in free salvation in justification, which is a fancy word for salvation, by faith alone, not by merit, not by anything you did in your life, not by good works, which you did to achieve salvation, not by the intervention of prayers or saints. Okay, so your friends and family were released from their obligation, and that connection between the living and the dead was severed. There was nothing the living could do for the dead. No intercession, no soul masses, no indulgences. There's no purgatory. Okay, so this is a radical change. Okay, and I'm sure it took generations. We assume, we always emphasize the speed of the Reformation, but I'm sure that customary beliefs lasted forever. You can't just get rid of the saints. Okay, they last, they change, they are transformed. But in any case, it's a radical movement. The Reformation is radical. Okay, it's changing everything. It's simplifying everything. Faithful Christians would ascend to heaven. The living should merely remember them, remember them, remember them. Remembrance. Okay, that's it. No obligation, and a big change between the living and the dead. But it's not quite that simple. I don't think that Christians, Protestant Christians, Reformed Christians, were released from their obligations or their anxieties. Certainly Christians who were followers of John Calvin, and that would be, the majority of Protestants in the 16th century, as Calvinism was a far more evangelical movement than Lutheranism was. And Calvin really emphasized, as I'm sure most of you know, predestination, that salvation was not universal, only the elect, which is a minority, were going to achieve salvation. And we could never really know if we were among the elect, but there were certain signs, and everyone's looking for signs. And so there is a great deal of anxiety at the end of life among followers of Calvin as to where their ultimate destination will be. So that is obviously a very complicating issue regarding death and remembrance following the beginning of the Reformation. The other one is that there are no rules, and I think this is what I'm pretty much going to segue into now, and I know that Dr. Baker is going to talk about this as well. Really, burial customs, funeral customs, customs relating to death become more of a social or customary or family kind of issue as opposed to a religious institution. All of the Protestant faiths recognize the Bible as the sole religious authority, and the Bible has nothing at all to say about funeral and burial customs. So customs become variant. They differ from place to place. And this variety reigns, and it also causes some tension. I think many, again, followers of Calvinism were wanted a more austere. I mean, they just wanted to get away from ceremony. Anything that was ceremonial kind of reeked of popery. So they wanted to kind of retreat from that. But on the other hand, people like customs and traditions. So there's definitely some tension there. But I love to compare. This sounds terrible to say this. So what kind of strange person I am, but I love to compare deathbed scenes, okay, from before the Reformation and from after the Reformation. Okay, you saw, that perfect death, that good death that I showed you a few frames ago, and now look at this picture of a deathbed, and we have many that are very similar to this in the 16th and 17th century across Europe. And it's a family. The family is there, but there's no priest there. There's no minister there. This is a family matter. The Reformers recognized only two sacraments: okay? Baptism and the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. So there's no need for deathbed priests. There's no last rites, okay? In fact, I mean, it's very many Protestants wanted no minister anywhere, not giving the service, nothing, just go, okay? This is a family matter, okay? No ground or space is more hallowed than another. So again, these are pre-Reformation ceremonies here. Here's a burial, here's a funeral. They're happening within the confines of the church. They are administered by the church, okay? This is all about the church. These are religious services, okay? But with Protestantism, they cease to be, to a certain extent. Again, nothing is as clear and finite as we want it to be. But let me compare. I love this comparison. I'm going to really work on it some more. But let me compare the leaders of the two dominant movements within Protestantism, John Calvin and Martin Luther. This is John. We don't really even know if John Calvin is buried here. John Calvin was buried in Geneva in secret. Okay, there were no services. There was no ceremony. He said it is good that famous men should be buried in unmarked graves. He wanted no pilgrimages to a grave. He was very concerned about pilgrimages because nothing could be more Catholic than pilgrimages, and he didn't want his grave to become a shrine. So that is going to be very influential in affecting the attitude of Calvinists, including Puritans, who followed this example. But contrast Calvin with Martin Luther. Look at Martin. That's a portrait of dead Martin Luther. That's a portrait of dead Martin Luther that was distributed all over. It was printed, okay, by his good friend and propagandist Lucas Cranach, who like painted everything Martin Luther did. He would make a beautiful painting and make a nice print, and would go up everywhere, including his death. Okay, death masks were made. Luther's house, it's still a shrine. It's called Luther's Death House. You go there. His house did become a shrine. His funeral was a big procession and printed funeral sermons, which become an incredibly important literary genre in the 16th and 17th centuries, both on the continent and in England. So I can't imagine a more stark contrast, okay, between Calvin and Luther in the early part of the 16th century. And I think this contrast sets the tone for how their followers are going to remember, okay, and mark the end of life. So when I get to England, I really do see two emerging Protestant traditions for end-of-life rituals. In Calvinism and then Puritanism, which is the English version of Calvinism. We see the ideal is very austere funerals with minimal ritual, community gatherings rather than services outside the church, with or without a preacher. Night burials become very common in the 17th century. Burial in municipal cemeteries rather than in church yards. I'll talk about that in a minute. I think that it's not just religion. I think it's the fact that the churchyards are too crowded in the 17th century that we see a big shift there. It's going to be a little different in North America, as Tab will tell you. With Lutheranism and what we call Anglicanism, the Church of England, the official Church of England from the second half of the 16th century onward, we see eulogies and sermons for the departed, often printed to intensify remembrance. We see these very large, elaborate funerals. They're called heraldic funerals because everyone brings their banners, and it's just a massive, massive display of respect for the departed, but also who's invited, who gets to go there. It's, it's a see and be seen kind of an event. Also acts acts like doles. The word doled, on the dole. Doles were large distributions of food or money to the poor, okay, on the occasion of a funeral. Gloves and rings. Gloves are so big in North America, so Tad's going to talk about that. But here's some lovely rings that were made for a funeral in 1661 in England. So funerals, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but because I'm going to go back a century to Elizabeth, because it's in the Elizabethan era, in the second half of the 16th century, that you really see the growth of the Puritan movement. The Puritanism movement is a resistance movement against the Church of England. The Puritans wanted more purification. They said that the Church of England was halfly reformed. Keep going, cleanse it, purify it. Okay, so there's lots of bones of contention between the Puritans, who are growing and growing and growing and are going to become very powerful in the 17th century, and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is definitely a Protestant. She's definitely a Protestant, but she likes ceremony. She likes bishops. She likes all the stuff that bishops wear. She likes music. She likes incense. She likes stained glass windows. She likes dancing. She loves ceremony. I don't know why I put dancing in there, but anyway, she loves ceremony, and she would not cleanse any of the ceremonial aspects of the Church of England, which made the Puritans more and more and more mad. So after she was dead, they just kept going. Okay, for Puritans, eulogies and these processions, they're too close to intercessionary prayers. It sounds like you're praying. Okay, and the elaborate funerals were wasteful and reminiscent of popery. So this is just a display. I want you to see some funeral sermons. I could put thousands of them up here. They're so popular. This is one from Germany. And then we have some English ones over here. They're so popular. This is such an important genre. And we have a lot of funeral sermons about women. Okay, a lot, and it's very, very interesting. It's completely understandable why we have so many about women, because men were very focused on telling women how they should behave in the 17th century. And an ideal woman, like this woman, Catherine Breder, has 2 funeral sermons, 2, because she's so great, because she's so perfect. So this needs to be printed up so every woman knows how to behave. Here's some pictures of heraldic funerals. Again, these were all recorded because, again, you want to intensify the remembrance as much as possible by printing it and disseminating it. There's Philip Sidney's funeral in 1587. So that's a 16th century funeral. This is Lady Lumley's funeral in 1658. And we have, after 1660, the funerals got so big that they had to regulate them by giving funeral tickets. And so these are funeral tickets. This is from a large selection at the British Museum. Please bring your ticket with you. And we see a lovely shroud. I'm going to talk about that in a minute at the bottom of this. So these are, wonderful examples of funeral ephemera, which is a category that just grows and grows and grows in the later 17th and the 18th century. Now, I don't have much to say about cemeteries. Dr. Baker's going to talk all about cemeteries. So those of you who are cemetery fans, you can get all that. I will say that I really think the plague is more important in pushing out the cemeteries from inner London. I just have a London perspective. I'm sorry. I'm sure it's different in rural areas, but I mean, all the complaints, I've been through all the City of London records in the 16th and 17th centuries, and every day there's a complaint that there's just no room to bury anyone. So they are making what's called suburban large cemeteries outside. This is one of the earliest Bunhill Fields. But these were kind of non-denominational. A lot of the nonconformists, like Quakers, okay, and other nonconformists would be buried in this cemetery later on. I think, in the 16th century, people wanted to be buried in their parish, but there just really wasn't room in the city. I'm sure it's very different. But look about, we have plagues in London in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, 1635, 1665. Death is all around them. There's just not room. Okay, I just wanted to say a little touch. I know a lot of people are interested in material culture, and I kind of went with spirituality, but there are some things I wanted to say. We don't have the rigid mourning rules of the 18th and 19th, or not pretty much 19th century, I think. We don't have that, okay, in the early modern period. We just don't, okay? People wear black, but they also wear white. There's this thing called white mourning, okay? There's a portrait of someone in white mourning. This is Anne of Denmark, the James I's queen, wearing black. She was the best dressed woman in Europe, and you can see why. And the other thing I wanted to say is over here on the right, you see a shroud and a coffin right by the side. This is from a broadside about the 1666 plague, which was, just terrible, 300,000 people. We don't have a lot of references to coffins, and I think that's because wood was so scarce. In my book, I talk about wood all the time. They're trying to learn how to graft trees because all the wood, all the first growth forests have been chopped down, and they just desperately need wood for their ships. You can't even build houses out of wood anymore, and you certainly coffins are way down. So shrouds seem to predate. You have these elaborate hearses in which the shrouded body is taken to be buried, but not in a coffin. So I'm kind of interested in what's happening with coffins. So maybe Tad can tell us more about that, and we'll talk about that. And so I am so thrilled about these excessive funerals that are complained about in the New World all the time, because you can tell that all the Puritans in the 17th century just kind of came over here to annoy everyone. And so that's what I'm going to turn it over to my colleague so he can talk about what's going on across the pond. Okay.
Thanks, Donna. Okay, I guess I will see if I can screen share now through the wonder of technology. And we'll try right here. Hopefully, can people see that?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, awesome, cool. So it's great to be here. Elizabeth, Carl, Dan, the city of Salem, you're doing great things with Charter Street, and it's wonderful to see. And it's wonderful to see former students and former colleagues and current colleagues, and in general, those of you some of you may not know this, but I just formally stepped down as an administrator, as vice provost, effective January 1st, and I'm really excited to be headed back to my home, my academic home, my academic family in the history department. And what better to start that with, actually, with my good friend and colleague, Donna Seger. This is a lot of fun. But as you folks already caught on, if you didn't know, Donna's a real hard act to follow here. So I'll do my best. I maybe want to start off with, about this. Maybe this sort of the trajectory of this talk in some degrees, and those my students and friends will know. I will have to invoke James Dietz right up front from Small Things Forgotten, where he talks about, the early settlers of New England come over as kind of transplanted Englishmen, and it's like he talks about the trajectory of a rocket that doesn't quite reach escape velocity. And it's sort of, so during the course of the 17th century, New Englanders became more and more distinct from people in England. But by the time of the Revolution, in some ways, ironically, they seem to be, while we're ready to go to war and declare independence from these people, we're really kind of like aping the English again. And that's kind of maybe the subtext here as to what's going on. And particularly, though, I sort of, in some degrees, Donna's done kind of the hard work, because she's the one that gets to talk about all the theology. And I will warn you, if you ever take a witchcraft course with either of us, you're going to get a lot of religion and theology. So she's done the hard work there, and I kind of get to talk about the fun, which is the material culture, because most of the things that she says kind of hold true in America. So what I want to do is sort of talk about some of those material manifestations. And I do want to start off by really with the meeting house, which to some degrees is ironic, because the point is, in Massachusetts, the meeting house, there are no churches, and meeting houses really have nothing to do with funerals. But let's start with them, because I think they're symbolic of the change that the Puritans bring over here. And also, too, even as Donna pointed out, there are many different Protestants and Protestant Reformations there were also in England many different Puritans. And that technically one would like to think of Puritan with a small p, because what in the late 16th century in England, what Puritanism with a small p refers to is a spectrum of reformers. Most English Protestants felt that something was wrong with the Church of England and with the Catholic Church, and frankly, even with the Church of England, which had kind of been, as we all know, kind of like a political matter for Henry VIII more so than a spiritual matter. But there was a range of solutions ranging from, maybe we just purge a few saints to, nope, it's all got to go, right? And long story short, it's those people who more or less are on the all got to go spectrum of Puritanism who form Massachusetts and many of the other settlements of New England. But even here, these people are not separatists. Those are those folks down in Plymouth. The Massachusetts Puritans, as we know from John Winthrop's famous sermon, A City Upon a Hill, Massachusetts Puritans come over here realizing that the Church of England is so corrupt that we can't reform it in England. We've got to leave to reform it. But in the process, we are going to be the shining beacon of what a godly world should be. And we are going to have that proper relationship with God and with our neighbors. And this sort of shows the naivety, right? We're going to come over here in America and do this, and people are just going to be so amazed by what we're doing here that they're going to want to become just like us. And this is how we're going to proselytize, just by doing our thing here in little old Massachusetts. See how that turned out for them, right? But it's going to be this very simple, the stripping of the altars, the elimination of the excess of all things that smack of popery. And you see that right off the bat in where they worship, because these are not churches. In England, a church is a building. In New England, Puritans worship in a meeting house. I mean, think of like an all-purpose municipal building, or sometimes referred to as the Lord's barn, because it is empty on the inside pretty much. By the way, you wouldn't want to be in there on a day like today because they're unheated, even though you have to be in there all day on Sunday for like 8 hours, right? So you're kept spiritually warm, maybe with a blanket, and that's about it. But the point is, these are not, you don't have an altar, you don't have angels or stained glass or gilt or anything. You're focusing all on the worship. And in fact, a church in Puritan New England doesn't refer to a building. It refers to the congregation of saints, of the Puritans who are elect. That is, they know that they are predestined, or they think they're predestined to go to heaven. I think they would have kind of been a fairly insufferable lot, frankly, because they have that self-knowledge. Though there's also that doubt, like Donna's mentioning about the death, that hour of death, where people are kind of like, I'm not really sure. Am I on the list or not? I thought I was, but now I'm not so sure. But the point is, the church actually refers then to the people, right? And so in New England, it is the church that meets in the meeting house, ironically, right? And it's simple. And you go there for worship on the Sabbath and also for lecture on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on where that is in your community. And also, too, though, this is where you go for like town meetings, for municipal meetings. And by the way, this is a wonderful replica Salem meeting house at the Rebecca Nurse Farm, which was actually created for 3 sovereigns for Sarah. But this is what they look like unadorned. And this is the simple unadorned interior. This is a 1785 Rocky Hill meeting house at Amesbury, owned by Historic New England. And it is just simple. No decoration here at all. And all focus in the building is on this spot right here, on the pulpit, raised up above the crowd, so that the minister can do the readings from the Bible and then can deliver his sermon. And that's what this is all about, right? And there's no saints, no nothing. That's all been gone. And in most towns, in New England towns, the majority of them, the meeting house is in the center of the town, so that no one has more than 3 or 4 miles to walk to meeting. As we know, in Salem, that kind of causes problems because it's such a big town. And, that's how we end up with people in Salem Village wanting their own meeting house, and all kinds of things happen because of that. But in most towns, so for example, here in Hingham, Massachusetts, very famous surviving 17th century meeting house known as the Old Ship. And this is the picture out behind it, where again, you have in the middle of town, you have the meeting house, and right behind it, you have the cemetery. Technically the burying ground, because again, this is not hallowed ground, and the burying ground could be anywhere. And more to the point is, it often was. And again, in this case, you'd say, well, isn't that convenient because you've got that right behind the meeting house where you're having the funeral? Nope. And well, it's behind the church because it's hallowed ground. Nope, nope, because there's no church and there's no hallowed ground. So you can bury people wherever you want, right? And that's what happens in many towns. So we have this kind of notion of New England like this, and even into the 19th century, you know, to go to Sturbridge Village and they have the church on the green, and behind it they've kind of replicated the cemetery even, right? But it's not for like religious reasons. By the way, in many towns, they don't do that. It doesn't look like they did that, but they did. And so, for example, here we are on the top of Burial Hill in Marblehead, and you're going like, hey, wait a second. So Burial Hill is nowhere near the meeting houses in the first church. Well, guess what? In the 17th century, the first meeting house built in Marblehead was indeed here, where we are literally standing on the top of Burial Hill. But again, that was a convenience. And within a few years, in the 1660s, when they built the second meeting house, it's in a different part of town. It's not next to the cemetery. So it doesn't matter. But there's a convenience factor there, right? And we could go on and look at how these, I'm actually playing in my head with the idea of sort of papers on the relationship between meeting houses and burial grounds in Massachusetts. Salem, of course, to Charter Street is kind of, again, is an exception, where right here we have really at the intersection of what is now Essex and Washington Street, we had the first meeting house, and in fact, like the meeting houses of the Congregational Church until well into the 19th century in Salem. You many recognize that building in downtown Salem. But where's the cemetery that goes with it? The burying ground, of course, is at Burial Point. And it's not all that close, right? It's a 5-minute walk down and around the corner. And actually, Burying Point, and now it's not a point anymore because of all the landfill and such, but it was this beautiful overlook over the harbor that really, again, it's a lovely spot to be buried, but it's not secular, it's secular ground, it's not sacred, and it's got nothing to do with where the meeting house is located. By the way, Boston does pretty much the same thing. If you look at where the meeting houses are and the cemeteries are, look in the North End, where Copp's Hill is nowhere near the Paul Revere House, and the Paul Revere House is about where the Mather House was and the Old North Meeting House, as opposed to the Old North Church, which is nearby to Copp's Hill, but of course is 18th century and is Anglican. And you go in there and you see angels and gilt everywhere, and no Protestant or Puritan worth his salt is going to go in there, right? Or in fact, even you go like, well, wait a second, Ted, what about King's Chapel? There's a cemetery right there, right? Well, yeah, but King's Chapel was a cemetery for 50 years. It's actually happened to be the property of one of the first people in Boston, a wealthy man who died. And King's Chapel, the Anglican church, isn't built there, till the 1680s. So it's kind of a coincidence, right? So again, in some towns, completely disassociated, and it doesn't matter where you bury people. And particularly too, again, since this is Salem, we have to work in the witch trials and folks associated with it a few times here. But if you go to even the outskirts of Salem, and Salem in the 17th century included places as far away as Beverly and Peabody and Danvers and even part of Middleton. And once you get out in the country like that, you have family cemeteries or neighborhood cemeteries. In Peabody, Exhibit A, the Francis and Rebecca Nurse Farm, home of the historic Nurse Cemetery. Also, a lot of, ironically, Putnams buried there because the nurses were related to the Putnams, and they ended up owning the farm as well. Or also, too, not a mile or two to the north, you have the historic Wadsworth Cemetery, which is more of a neighborhood cemetery where there were a lot of Putnams buried as well. And again, I love the Wadsworth Cemetery because right here, this stone right here, is none other than Elizabeth Parris, who, of course, is the wife of Reverend Samuel Parris, who dies in 1696, not long before he leaves Salem for good. So again, if you get out into the country, you are going to, again, there's no meeting house anywhere near either of these burial grounds, right? It was more important to be interred with neighbors or with family and no one was going to go take anybody a funeral procession all the way in, the 3 or 4 miles in to Salem to be buried at Burial Hill. So Massachusetts funerals in the first decades are to a settlement. Simple processions, not really, I mean, you call them funeral, but really what it is it's a funeral procession, and they take the coffin from the home of the deceased to the burial ground. And they do it pretty unceremoniously. There's no interment with prayers, no sermon, no church or meeting house, no minister even present. You go from home and you have an orderly procession with loved ones, with mourners, with family, and with pallbearers. And then you get to the burial ground and there's a hole dug. And literally what you do is put the body in the coffin, in the grave, and people stand around and fill the grave in, and then they go. They may go back eventually to the house for some sort of modest ceremony. But again, this is not about ceremony, because again, anything like ceremony smacks of the Catholic Church, or God forbid, even the Anglican Church. And the Puritans say, "Niet, niet, niet, we don't want it." No grave markers in the first decades. If you go into an early Massachusetts cemetery, and the earliest stones you find are 1670s, 80s, 90s at the earliest. Again, first Puritans over here, they're like John Calvin. Nope, we don't need a burial ground cemetery marker at all. Or if we do, maybe it's like this one here in the background, which is a replica one at St. Mary City in Maryland, one of my favorite 17th century places to go. Wooden markers. These are not meant to be permanent, right? They will fade after time. So anything more than this smacks of Catholic excess. Now, except civic and political leaders. When someone like John Winthrop Sr. dies, or Jr., well, then we better have an important procession to show due respect to the office and the person. And increasingly, that will kind of become the model for, we do need to note this passing. But initially, observers kind of say like, God, this is almost irreligious, the way the Puritans are basically dumping people in the ground and putting dirt over them, and not even a prayer. What the heck is this? This is sort of the extreme, the way things start. But as I say, they will definitely change, right? But so you notice this, if you go into, so like a Charter Street, there are gravestones everywhere. Some parts not quite so many as others. And that may be a clue, actually, though, particularly if you look at those areas that don't have a lot of gravestones. My suspicion is that probably maybe the earlier parts, right? Because those are the ones we had people buried without markers or wooden markers that are gone, or in some cases, really just tiny little field stones, maybe like the size of your fist, or small rock. But I like to point out where I live here in York, Maine, we have the Village Cemetery, 1667. It is literally maybe a couple hundred yards from the site of the 1667 meeting house. And if you look there in the middle of it, all you have is this very modest marker in the middle, which is actually a 20th century memorial to the victims of the 1692 raid on York. And I think people assume that's where people were buried, because if you look right behind that memorial, right in the middle of this graveyard, there's no markers. What gives, right? Well, no, this was that earliest part before they were using gravestones. The earliest dated gravestone is the early 1700s in this cemetery. They may have been some a few years before that, but maybe not. Or if they were, they probably were just using rocks, because this is kind of the country. And in fact, actually, my good friends Peter and Jeanette Sablock are geologists and geoarchaeologists extraordinaire, and they did ground penetrating radar in the Village Cemetery to see and to make sure that there are grave shafts there. Honestly, what I had thought was there might be a big mass grave here, because we know that actually this week, 330 years ago, was the 1692 raid on York, and in January, 48 people were killed in a Native American attack. And I keep thinking that they probably were buried in a mass grave somewhere in the village, but not here. These are all individual shafts of people who were buried here, probably starting in the mid 1600s. So, and you see this in other places too. Again, yeah, I do occasionally leave Maine and even Essex County. And in this case, I went down to Sudbury, actually to North Wayland Burying Ground. North Wayland was part of Sudbury in the 17th century. And when they divided the towns, Wayland actually got possession, if you will, of the original cemetery and the site of the first meeting house. So here we are, and you'll see this rock here in the foreground. This is a plaque that says, this is the site of Sudbury's first meeting house in 1638. Okay, well, that explains that sort of part of the area there between that rock and the tree back there. But this whole area around here is nearly devoid of graves. What gives? Well, again, this is where the first settlers were buried, didn't need markers, or maybe something really modest and not particularly permanent. And so you'll notice these gaps in especially, as Donna says, when you get out into the country. If you're in Boston or Salem, there aren't many gaps because they keep on burying more people. But if you get out into the country, there are gaps where there aren't markers, and that's because there are plenty of people buried there. And frankly, I've always wondered how, people had good memories. They knew where people were buried, I think. But again, maybe wooden markers, because back then, if you had a cedar marker, that might last 50 or 100 years easily. I've seen a family one down south from the 1870s that's still intact. It's still legible, which is kind of remarkable. Anyhow, what was I doing in North Wayland? Well, you folks know me. I was on the track of Samuel Parris, who died in in Sudbury. And look out back here, well behind the meeting house, though, and you'll see, he doesn't have a gravestone, Samuel Parris, probably just as well. But interestingly, one of those stones out there is his grandson, Samuel Parris III, who died a few years after Samuel Parris himself in 1742. Anyhow, so visit a local cemetery and you'll get an idea as to where, not maybe the original meeting house was, but also too, where the original center of that cemetery was, because there may not be anybody there. Or go out into the country like this cemetery in Kittery, Maine, right next to an area. There was a new subdivision, about 10, 15 years ago. And there's my buddy Pete Sablock in the distance. And you probably won't realize this, but between Peter and I are probably at least 20, maybe 25 interments. And you would have no way of knowing this whatsoever, except when you walk over the land, you notice shallow undulations where the coffins collapsed and they sink. And then also these tiny little rocks, one there and one there and one there and one there. And I could keep pointing them out, but you get the idea. And again, these are rocks that basically you have to watch out. When you walk through there, you could kick them and knock them over and they're out of place, and they probably are. So you have a lot of graveyards like this in the region, out in the country, and a lot of old ones that are found by accident, by development occasionally, unfortunately. But we know people were probably being buried out here from probably the 1660s or so. And the homes are nearby. They're like a couple family farmsteads that are a little bit away. So that's what those early burial grounds look like, right? And in York, by the way, we have over 200 family and neighborhood cemeteries. And again, it makes me think, particularly here too, where like you didn't have as strong, people weren't as strong Puritan in their faith, and they didn't have as strong a sense of community. I don't think there was as much need for people to feel like, oh, we're going to go all bury them in the village. It's like, nope, family farm is just fine. They're perfectly safe here. No hallowed ground. By the way, one of the ideas of hallowed ground, when you're in purgatory, the demons can still get you, right? Well, again, don't worry about demons. Don't worry about purgatory. Nope. We just want you close. We want to be able to visit. You're going to be in the backyard. When you do get early gravestones, again, they tend to be 1670s, 80s, 90s. And these earliest ones, for the most part, and there are always exceptions through, but most of the earliest ones are like this, plain, no fancy engraving on it, just the name and the date, right? That's it. So again, this is kind of in keeping. We want a permanent marker, nothing fancy. But right, I guess to some degrees, thank heavens, within a few years, they decide they like something better, because we just love the amazing gravestone art in Charter Street. Some of my favorite examples of it here. Things have changed. Now we all have to have fancy death's heads and stones that were in most cases at this point probably carved in Boston. In the 18th century, you do get some local Salem carvers as well too. But what a change, right? So things have drastically changed, and this is sort of shows how things have changed in the course of 30 or 40 years. And this, of course, again, for lifestyles of the rich and famous, here's William Stoughton's tomb, died 1701 in Dorchester. And here I am with a couple of friends, including, by the way, the other Elizabeth Peterson, this one, Elizabeth Trask Peterson, Richard Trask's daughter. And we were great because we were really studying Stoughton's tomb. And you want to talk about skulls? Wow. But this is like a tomb that was clearly imported from England for a man befitting Stoughton's wealth and status as the deputy governor, really as acting governor when he died. And of course, as we all know him as the Chief Justice of the Witch Trials Court. But again, this is so out of place for typical New England tomb even, but it's representing that high end of what wealthy British society would have had for a tomb at this time period. So things have kind of starting to come full circle for the rich and famous, even by 1700. This looks like what Stoughton's family was trying to escape from in England originally, but now, no, this is the proper respect that we need for one of the leading Puritan magistrates of New England, and frankly, also too, the death of the old guard, right? So by 1700 or so, we see things kind of changing to like they were in England. Funeral processions now involve elaborate mourning, clothing, funeral rings, scarves, gloves, not just for civic and religious leaders, but if you can afford it, as much as possible for your loved ones. And as a way of sort of showing who's the inner circle, who are the pallbearers, they may get gold rings. Who is the family, they may get scarves. Who are the friends who are mourners, they may get gloves, as opposed to the other folks who just kind of tag along, right? So it's a way of reinforcing community and hierarchy, showing friendship and neighborliness, but it also becomes like this huge opulent display of wealth. But that isn't all. All of a sudden, gradually, we're starting to have graveside prayers. And increasingly now the minister is allowed to attend, even if he's not just a family friend, but maybe the minister is going to have prayers. Whoa, 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 whoa. This is really very odd for Puritans, isn't it? And yeah, we have funeral sermons being preached, usually the following Sunday, not on site in the church, in the burying ground, there's no ceremony in the church with the body. But even, of course, funeral sermons begin to be published in the 18th century in Massachusetts, like what Donna was sort of showing as well. And maybe the more amazing thing to me is what may have started as a simple funeral procession returning to the house to pay the respects to the family, to commiserate, perhaps share a silent prayer. Over time, you begin to have these massive, lavish receptions with huge amounts of food and alcohol. And of course, the example that a lot of you probably know about, get to that in a second, but I want to put this quote in here by Stephen Bullock to reiterate Donna's point. There's a great article that he did on funerals called Of Concern in Funerals, Ritual Material Culture in the Large Funeral in the Age of Samuel Sewall, because Samuel Sewall in his diary attends all these funerals and writes them down in great detail. They're wonderful, but this is published online and you can find it if you just Google that in the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, New Views of New England, a really wonderful collection of essays. And I'm not saying that because I wrote the first one in it, but it's really, it's a wonderful collection of stuff. And this is maybe my favorite piece in it. But by refusing to make the burial spiritual, because again, no, we can't do that because that would smack of the Catholic Church, but they make it this huge social event, right? Y'all come and there'll be good food and good wine. And so my favorite example of this, some of you heard of this fellow, Reverend George Burroughs, late of Salem Village. In 1683, when he returns to the village, he's arrested over his wife's funeral. Now, Burroughs had bought 5 yards of cloth for the funeral procession and for mourning clothes. He bought 2 gallons of Canary wine for her funeral reception, probably Sack, which is a fortified wine, think Madeira, right? Or port, good fortified wine. So a good time a respectful good time would have been had by all at this. Now, Burroughs was a minister. He wasn't arrested for that. He was arrested for the fact that he hadn't been paid by Salem, so he couldn't reimburse John Putnam, who had advanced him £7 to pay for the expenses. Who knew, right? So again, it's like these elaborate funerals, people can't afford them, but they're expected to have them. So what do? Quickly, because we want to get to some questions here and a little discussion. What explains these changes? Well, in short, a lot of it is related to Puritan decline, Puritan declension. And we could talk for no more than a week or two on that and start invoking Perry Miller and everyone would fall asleep. I do recommend, in short, take a look at David Stannard's book, The Puritan Way of Death, on a lot of this, which is very good. But the Puritans felt they were in decline. Puritans came over here for this new experiment and they were going to convince the world to be like them. But by the 1660s, this was clearly a failure, right? In England, the Puritan movement is over, really, with the restoration of Charles II. And even before then, people were going back to England because the Puritans had taken over, Cromwell had taken over. But by the 1660s, kind of the jig is up, and this is not going to be the wave of the future, but Massachusetts is kind of like left behind like the Rump Parliament almost, right? 2 years later, in 1662, the Halfway Covenant. Church membership is declining so precipitously. Massachusetts, the first generation were church members. Their children, they want to believe, they want to be like mom and dad, but they haven't had the spiritual urge. What happens when their kids are born? We have this halfway covenant to allow those children to be baptized, even though their parents are not full members of the church. Otherwise, those kids could go right to hell, right? They die. So declining church membership, declining fervor in the church. King Philip's War in 1675, God is angry. Again, all of these things are wrong. And so to some degrees, a lot of the change in funerals is in a weird way a reflection of this and also indicative of this at the same time. Because in the face of these changes, as David Stannard suggests, Puritans want to celebrate the lives of the first generation. Those pillars of the community that are gone, and every time one dies, we need to celebrate them and also, close ranks and show our faith within the community. But also, too, Massachusetts has become a victim of its own success. Steve Bullock talks about the rise of gentility, but what he's really talking about is this increasing prosperity in the Bay Colony, where you have fancy, wealthy merchants like Major Savage, not only wearing these fancy lace and gold outfits with big gilt swords, but then also, God forbid, they're having their portrait painted, showing this. I mean, this would be unacceptable behavior, but this has become standard Puritan practice, even amongst the most devout by that time. Why? Because Puritan merchants can afford to do this because Massachusetts is a runaway economic success. Thank God for the cod, right? But also, too, at the same time, this wealth is temptation. It's a temptation for Puritans to excess, as well as to secular pursuits, like, frankly, even being a merchant. And again, we can talk about good deeds versus good works, but also the fact that reflecting glory to God and being the best you can as a merchant means that you're successful, right? And all that sort of stuff. But the point is this prosperity helps undermine Puritanism, but at the same time, too, it also provides the wealth to spend on funerals. Yeah, let's spend it. But that's also related to this other thing that I could talk about all night, and I won't, but that is the consumer revolution. Because starting around 1690 in England and then in her colonies, consumers of the middle classes, the gentle classes, and then the middling classes begin to purchase lots of stuff. Why? In part because they can. They're wealthier. There's more, and also too, there's more manufactured goods, and they can do this and show it in conspicuous consumption. They can show that they're gentle, even if they're not, or as good as being a gentleman, right? And clearly, these fancy funerals of the 18th century are a clear indication of the consumer revolution, where people are wanting to conspicuously show by inviting people over to these fancy dinners with fancy imported ceramics or porcelain, the whole idea of tea services and tea tables and tea parties, drinking exotic tea, consumer revolution. And these are the kinds of ways. So funerals too. Let's buy, we have to have gloves for everybody. We have to have rings for the bearers. Oh, and we can't let anyone out who's a family friend or member has to have a scarf too. So in a weird way, by 1700, literally one thinks that some of these early Puritans are probably spinning in their graves at the way they're being buried by their kids and their grandkids, who think this is what's right for grandma or grandpa, but in fact is completely, would have been abhorrent to them at the time. So anyhow, I've said more than enough. And I don't know, Donna, I know we don't want to, probably we could talk for all night, but I think the one thing that you wanted, I know you wanted to talk about was this whole thing over coffins, right? So.
Yeah, just quickly, because it's such a relatively small thing compared to all the other things that you've laid out here. I mean, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but I'm kind of focused on wood in the 17th century. And also in 1666, the English government passed, certainly right in the aftermath of the plague that year, the English government passed a law that all shrouds had to be made of wool. Okay. There was deviation before that. There was, muslin and linen. Everyone felt that muslin and linen were better for shrouds, but muslin and linen were not English goods. Wool was English good, and they were supporting the protection of wool and cloth. So for 200 years, till 1863, I can't believe this. From 1666 to 1863, all English shrouds had to be made of wool. And they were clearly using the funeral rites as a way to kind of, push the economy. And so I'm wondering if it's shrouds versus coffins. Old world shrouds and new world coffins.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And the real short answer is, and I've asked around a bit, and if anyone is out there who knows, in New England at least, there have been few, if any, 17th century interments that have seen archaeological investigation.
Oh, really?
In Virginia, more so. But again, Virginia is just a different creature. And a lot of the people, so for example, like Jamestown, they're just dumping people in the ground in shrouds, especially during starving times and plague. And of course, frankly, they're occasionally eating them before they put them in the ground, right?
I heard that.
And I don't mean to pick on my Virginian friends, but we do have that one case of Jamestown. Yeah. But so that's not my point is, I don't think it's necessarily a really good example. We do know in the 17th century, they have some really elaborate coffins. I mean, they're the lead-lined coffins in St. Mary City for the Calvert family. Really? By the late 17th century. But I think as far as I can tell, again, we'll probably find out archaeologically eventually, but it really seems clear that coffins seem to be there from the get-go. A couple of reasons. One is because, there's lots of wood, and it may be a simple coffin, but it's reasonably accessible and available. And also because you do need something to have the funeral procession with, and a shroud isn't going to cut it or necessarily probably a pall. And in England, there will be like a pall and a coffin that belongs to the parish in many cases. Right. And it reused. In some cases, even some of them cleverly have like the trapdoor at the bottom, so the the shroud can come out, right? And they just sort of, there you go. But as far as we can tell, I think, and again, I think it remains to be seen. Because certainly the problem is by the 18th century, when we know there are some cemeteries that have been excavated, you find lots of coffin hardware. And that seems to be the case even in many 17th century ones in Virginia. And I kind of suspect here as well. And also too, families that had tombs, we do know, like when Samuel Sewell talks about going into the family tomb and he has to move the coffin for his son, who was only named Posthumous, who died prematurely. And he talks about moving the coffins around so there's room for other coffins as more members of his family died. So, and again, now the problem is, was that really true for like poor folk? What about like victims of the Salem witch trials? Would they have initially just had shrouds? Probably, if they had that at all. And I won't get into that. That's a whole nother talk. Yeah,
we can go for a while.
Exactly. So, but I think that's someone else may have some thoughts on that. But I think I don't know, Carl, Dan, should we open it up to questions from the floor?
Yes. So I've got a couple questions. I am reiterating my call for questions. People are being shyer than I know them to be. I will be submitting questions anonymously if that makes a difference. But I honestly, while again, send them to Dan or myself. We've got a couple. We'd like to get some more. A question that I actually have while I'm waiting for people to come in is, as there's a shift into more municipal burials in municipal burying grounds, what typically, I know it's going to be different in London and in the Americas and stuff, what typically is the amount of permission or sort of like even payment that would be required to bury in a municipal burying ground? Typically, how much, who do you got to check with before you send somebody over there?
Wow, that's a good one.
It's a very good question.
Thank you.
So I think normally it would be accepted practice that the problem is these early, in the 18th century at least, these first kind of municipal or village cemeteries don't really, you don't have plots. So that's the interesting thing too, we didn't even talk about, was at this point, and I think, Donna, this kind of reflects really sort of a more medieval tradition, like you have the whole community of saints and you're buried amongst the community, and you don't necessarily have to be buried right next to your family, right?
No.
So it wasn't like you had burial plots that you had to buy. No one bought perpetual care.
No.
It was a kind of a given. So I don't know. And also too, sometimes it'll be in like the sort of like in the town records, but oftentimes it'll be sort of part of the parish records, even when the minister will keep when people are interred. But there doesn't seem to be any sort of like real paperwork on this. It's sort of the assumption that, like, if people want, they can be buried in the village cemetery. The only thing where I will say is it's not hallowed ground, so technically anybody could be buried there, right? But having said that, if you tried to bury like a suicide or a murderer or a convicted witch in Charter Street, all hell would have broken loose. And now, it's funny because I don't know of any law that says you couldn't, but it just would not have been allowed. And in fact, we know that, the suicides, for example, would be buried at crossroads, or they've actually been found in some places like just outside the walls of a village cemetery. And I do know there is one request, I think, was made of Samuel Sewall when he was one of the leaders of the colony, where someone who had I can't remember, someone who had died under unusual circumstances, and I can't remember if they were a murderer or something, or felon. They were a felon, and he actually, under the circumstances, he actually granted permission. He allowed permission. He said, "Okay, well, we'll let you be buried in the burial ground." But as far as like, I think pretty much if you were like a good upstanding member of the community, sure, in you go, right? And it was maybe the choice not to be. Like in Salem, there were Quakers. There's a Quaker burial ground, as many of you know, out on Outer Essex Street. And in those cases, I'm sure the Quakers go like, yeah, no, we don't want to have anything to do with those people. We're having our own little plot up here, and no, we don't want to be there. But having said that, there are Quakers buried, like the Shaddocks, who are one of Salem's leading early Quaker families, who in fact, as late as the later 1600s, 1692, 93, there are Shaddocks buried in Charter Street. So yeah, that sounds like a good thesis question right there, Carl. So
that was because of the policy of the Crown, right? I mean,
yes. Yep.
Toleration for Quakers. So here in Salem, they couldn't.
Right. So I think the town would have had to let them be buried there, but it's the Quakers go like, no thanks, right?
Both the English records, I'm sure the New England records are that way too. I mean, the English start keeping parish records in the early Tudor period. So we have really good burial records that go back to 1530. But then there's a big, the plague of 1666 just changes everything. It's just so terrible. The death is just so much, it becomes a management problem. And you see, new administrative procedures set in after that. But things really get organized in the 18th century when you have the Guild of Undertakers, and then they really rationalize everything.
There's a profit to be made here, right? I mean, it's funny. Again, if you think about it, not trying to make too many grim parallels to today when we talk about plagues and burial customs, but when you do have your system overloaded, right, where the morgues can't take any more bodies, all kinds of unfortunate things can start to happen, right? And that was true whether it was 1666 or today. Yeah.
Thank you. My call out has worked, and I am now receiving.
All right.
I'm now receiving questions. I've also received a couple of comments re Coffins.
Oh, good.
Good.
Just real quick. At least Rachel Meyer does say that at least for coffins, Robert Mulliken depicts coffins on his footstones. So there's definitely,
Yes.
they definitely
Yeah, they
are coffins. But it's also been pointed out that there doesn't seem to be evidence of those in Ferryland, Newfoundland yet, because there were bans on cutting wood.
I was wondering about Newfoundland. I
Yeah.
happened
So it is,
to.
yeah. So a little bit of the answer is going to be both. So I got questions coming in. Dan, do you have? I know you have questions.
One thing about that, and yeah, Robin, thanks for chipping in about Newfoundland. But I did want to mention the problem too is though, is like you have coffins on those gravestones, but that also to some degrees implies the people who can afford gravestones are the ones who can afford coffins for sure, right? So I think they're probably there, but anyhow, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dan, what you got?
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One, someone is curious what the Puritans thought of the idea of resurrection.
Well, it's all about predestination and whether you're saved or not, right, Donna? I mean, like if you're if either you make the cut or you don't, and I mean this is it is
Small minority. Small.
Yes, it's the elect. They are called the elect. Now, again, as I say, I think they're a pretty insufferable bunch because who decides who's the elect? They do, right?
No, God does. God does.
Well, yes, I know. God does, but here's the thing, right? Puritans never really know for sure, and this is the thing. People go like, "Well, how do you have any social control at all?" Well, you never quite know for sure. But Puritans think they know. That God has spoken to them in some way. They have that moment, and we were absolutely right. God decided, and then of course God decides. Really, when the earth created, He knows. So even before you're born, your fate is known to God and technically to no one else. But unfortunately, if you aren't on the list, you're going to spend eternity in hell, and there's no good deeds, nothing can do anything about it. And again, there's no intermediary. It's like instant. You're going to heaven or hell. I mean, is that, Donna? Is that
No,
fair?
I think so. I think Luther has. If you're interested in Protestant concepts of resurrection, I would go with Luther rather than Calvin. I think Luther believed in predestination as well, but he decided it was just not going to work. It was he decided he was just going to not talk about it, and so he talks about more positive things, more hopeful things. He talks more about resurrection. So I would go with Luther rather than Calvin,
because otherwise we'll end up spending the whole evening talking about the ranters and their idea of social control and religious ceremonies in the tavern. But because if there's no social control, if I'm going to heaven, I might as well have a good time at the tavern tonight.
Well, tying back to that, this seems almost a Puritan question here. If the Catholics believed that the dead could get out of purgatory or limbo through purchase of indulgences and obviously just time spent there, the question is then, when did people go to hell?
Well, there are a whole list of sins that just cast them straight to hell. But the vast majority of the people were in this gray zone. For varying degrees of time. So, but there are a whole list of, it's very prescribed faith. There's a whole list of sins, murder, obviously, that, believe me, there's no purgatory. It's straight to hell.
But, and also too, and Donna, I think you've been very, very, very good in I don't think you've even I've heard the word indulgence once here, right? But this is the whole thing with Luther and why he's so freaked out at the Catholic Church is because when they start selling indulgences which give people a pass from purgatory to heaven, right? And in that sense, they're cutting the line, right? So,
no, only a short period of time, though.
Right.
Indulgences were, you could actually buy them. They're one of the first things that were printed up in the 15th century where I've seen one. It's just an amazing thing. It's an indulgence form. It's like on a pad. It's like a pad. Okay. And there's, Jesus Christ up here. And then there's a blank slate and you fill in how the person who's selling you the indulgence fills in how much you want to pay, whether it's for you or a relative. There's 2 lines you fill in and then you strip it off and there's the indulgence.
Okay. Yeah.
Forms in the 15th century.
Let's no more indulgences.
All right, Dan, what do you got?
Yeah, I have it's kind of a multi-part, but it's kind of they all relate together. It says, how do we how can we understand the issue of closeness and separation during the plague, especially in relation to the current pandemic? Is there a stigma related to death by plague? And a kind of follow-up of that is, were the funerals during active plague uncelebrated as many of the deaths during this pandemic?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of people doing work now, obviously.
Plagues are popular.
Making correlations between past pandemics. I'm going to have my students working on a section called What We Can Learn from Early Modern Plagues. The plagues are such a total breakdown. The really bad plagues, the Black Death and the 1666 plague are such a breakdown that there really isn't, you don't get the sense that there is time for any of the negotiations that we seem to be going through today. You can't afford to be, no one would be an anti-vaxxer. If there was a vaccination, they'd take it. I mean, no one would do that. I mean, there is the worst thing that I can say that I probably has the best correlation, because I was writing about it actually for my book during the pandemic, is the City of London's plague orders, where they ordered people to be shut in, people who had, it's called shut in. If there was plague detected in a household, a plague official appointed by the city would come in and literally put a red cross on the door, and the people would not be allowed out of the house. Okay, they were shut into their houses. So this is the form of extreme quarantine that was in effect during 1666. So it's just extreme breakdown. There's none of the, I wouldn't say a stigma. Everyone is just scared. There's no sense of, oh, they have the plague over there. Although sometimes I was noticing increasing associations between poverty and plague, because the neighborhoods in London that were really struck the hardest were the poorest neighborhoods, of course. So you get some of those kind of accusations as well. But the shut-in policy really was horrible. Horrible to be writing about that during last year. Absolutely terrible.
All right, here's a question about this. Question is about lead-lined coffins, and as that was mentioned, and the question is, weren't those for especially degraded bodies to avoid leakage and smell, or is there another reason for that you might line your coffin with lead? Obviously, radiation's not something they're.
That's yours, Tad. I don't know that.
The only one, usually, yeah. I think there was they were really extremely expensive, as you can imagine. And you only see them in America. There are only these three known from the Calvert family that were buried actually inside the Church of St. Mary at St. Mary's City. And I think too, in England, where you see these, it is for the dukes and the earls and the lords in the tombs. And so it is sort of a sign of wealth. And I do think, and again, I don't know a lot about it because they are so, it's, over on this side of the pond, we just don't say it. But I do think that's very much true, is that it was a sign of wealth and status, and also as a way to perhaps, sort of preserve the mortal remains of the deceased. And only a few could do that. So, but again, it's so weird. I honestly, I've not given it a lot of thought aside from those three that came up in St. Mary's, because it's a pretty unique practice, at least over here.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure of the sources. It's been very long ago. When I worked at Colonial Williamsburg, they talked about, as coming up to the American Revolution, the idea that some bodies were transported back to England for burial in lead-lined coffins to preserve them better for the voyage.
I would believe that. I've also heard of, in New England in the 17th century, more primitive practices. If people died away, like that it might be put like in a pickling barrel or something like that. Honestly, yeah, something. It's like, I'll have to see if I can find the reference. And the one that I really want to know about is Thomas Lake, who was killed on the attack on Aroostook Island, August 14, 1676. And his body was found the following March on the tip of Georgetown, the next island where he'd been killed in an Indian attack. And they brought his body back home, and he's buried on Copp's Hill with a gravestone. It says, "Perfidiously slain by ye savages at Kennebec." It's one of my favorite gravestones, because it's an early one and it's about a foot thick, and it has just the writing on it. But anyhow, the point is, like, they said that his body was wondrously preserved. And I've kind of wondered, what was preserved like after like a Maine summer and winter, and how they got him there. But I've come up across some other ones where I'll have to see if I can find the references to bodies being put in different sorts of alcoholic solutions and stuff for onboard ship occasionally, which just sounds pretty grim. Yeah.
Dan,
Boy,
do you
we
have any
really
more
ran
questions?
the gamut in this talk.
This is really kind of grim stuff. I've been kidding about it for the past couple of weeks about, like, oh dear God, Protestant death. This is just a nice light topic, right, Donna?
Suggestion from Newfoundland is apparently they did have coffins full of salt was another option.
Salt.
Oh,
Of course.
yeah.
Thanks, Robin.
Off the coast of Labrador. Yep. Dan, do you have any other questions?
I do. Do either of you know about the early 18th century tombstone carver whose work I have seen in Ipswich and over in Raleigh, whose carved faces were not death's head, but instead highly stylized, simple spirit faces. His work was very different than that of any other stone carvers. The faces were almost abstract, elongated, and flat with O-shaped mouths.
So
Hold on. That must be from Rachel, we've got a great conservator here. But I'm going to jump on that because could you also address, Tad? To me, it seems interesting that the funeral ephemera of the 17th century looks very similar to the grave carvings in the later 17th. The early and mid 17th century English funeral ephemera looks very similar to the grave carvings from later on.
yeah, no, they absolutely do. And we do know that a lot of the more formal grave carvings, not these folk ones that we're talking about here, are sometimes they're literally copied out of English books.
All right.
Okay, so I'm not surprised at all to see that. And again, in many cases, we don't know, but I suspect if someone were to really do their research on it, they could find that. So I have not studied individual carvers, but I am familiar with exactly what you're talking about. But having said that too, it is not just a local Essex County individual carver phenomenon. You have these spirit carvings in the 18th century throughout at least eastern Massachusetts. And again, like there's a bunch of them down in Plymouth Colony, Plymouth County that are I'm sure are other carvers. And again, like, I mean, only thing I would recommend is, like, I'll go back to Dietz's and Small Things Forgotten, and he's the first one to kind of notice these things. And you can see these sort of stylized evolutions where to some degrees, some of these things, these ideas start out as death's heads in the 17th century, and then they gradually morph into these more and more sort of stylized. And again, I think it's a lot of different carvers doing them. I think, yeah, that you could probably trace individual carvers making individual ones in unique towns, but it's clearly an 18th century practice that needs a lot more study. And I have not studied it. I'm fascinated by it. Maybe there may be someone out there who really has looked at what's going on there, because the normal trajectory of death's head, and then cherub, and then the willow and urn, the cult of mourning, and all that good stuff. These things just take a detour and just go off into these odd sort of abstractions, these odd spirit-like, ghost-like images. And to me also too, though, and of course, when you get me going in this, I start talking about things like some of these other images that they have on these stones and the carvings. And to what degree, Donna, are these reflecting like things like Essex County furniture makers and some of the imagery that they are using? Now, clearly you don't have a spirit head per se, but it makes me want to spend a lot more time studying 18th century Essex County furniture as well, to see if you have any kind of parallels in the imagery and the stuff that's being used in the spirit stones. And I'm not suggesting that the gravestone carvers are also guys who are moonlighting as furniture makers, but it's clear that those ideas and those vocabularies of symbols and imagery are being shared back and forth amongst the different craftsmen and artisans working in different materials, whether it be slate or whether it be wood. So that's a really good question on those spirit carvings and their process. But again, just sort of points out how much more work there needs to be done. There are some good books on stone carvings, obviously, that are out there, and where they trace individual carvers and the sort of process. But honestly, there's still a whole lot we we don't know. And I wish I knew a lot more, but because it's endlessly fascinating.
Quick
I'll have to
point
leave it
of
at that.
clarification.
Yeah.
Rachel did not ask that question.
Oh!
Rachel knows all the carvers.
There you go. See?
And if I can get an image of that stone carver, she will identify who that was. Just
Okay.
a point.
Yeah, that
Moving
that
on.
was asked, if we can say names, that was asked by Lindsay, so.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
But
no.
I have a question here. We're getting near the end of our time, but I want to boost through as many as we can. In Lexington, there is a section where all the late 17th and early 18th century gravestones are in an oval. They're mostly facing each other and not all seemingly related. What might be the reason for that?
So yeah, I have actually seen that, and short answer is I really want to study it some more. But I think to me, I think the real short answer, honestly, unless there's some unique group of folks like Freemasons or something, which is too early, but it's late 17th century. My initial thought is this could be an example of gravestones being moved. If you look, it's actually an assignment I give my students, gravestones, and look at them as a landscape. And honest, so they'll know this well. If you go to most of these gravestones are in most of the cemeteries were altered at some time or another to look differently. So for example, again, if you go to a place like Old Granary in Boston, they've literally moved pretty much all the stones there. Or the most scandalous one to me, honestly, is the cemetery in the Salem Peabody line, where we know there was a WPA project in the 1930s, where they decided they needed to sort of straighten and organize the gravestones. And at that point, they decided there were just too many. So they literally took some of the 18 stones to the Peabody dump. Yeah.
What?
Yes. Yes. Because there were too many gravestones. So again, when you go into, here's the problem, right? So in other words, when you go into the Lexington or any of these cemeteries to some degrees, or even the famous ones like John Haythorne, don't necessarily assume with 100% certainty that the stone represents where the body actually lies. It may have been moved any one of a number of times. The only ones you can really have some more faith in are the tombs, because we know the tombs probably didn't move a lot. But I'm really suspect when I see things like gravestones in a circle. I'm kind of going like, yeah, someone decided this was a really cool idea during the colonial revival, I fear. And I'll blame it. Donna, you know me, I'll blame it on the colonial revival. Oh.
They probably
But it would be really interesting to look at those list of names and see who they are and see if there was any kind of relationship. Because to me, the idea though too of like taking a bunch of Puritans or even Protestants and burying them in a circle is really kind of repugnant to the whole notion of being buried, so that on the resurrection you can it's like it's convenient that you can rise from the grave heading due east to Jerusalem, because that's what you're supposed to do. And to be in a circle would just make a mess of that, wouldn't it? So I don't think it's original. It's a long way of saying it.
There is another one in Stockbridge, apparently, a ring of stones.
Huh. Yeah, and I've actually seen 19th century. I've seen 19th century rings in a cemetery in Maine, and I think when you're getting to that time period, I might believe it a little more, and then maybe you're getting into things like spiritualism and things like that. I don't know, but it still strikes me as being a very, very, very non-Protestant, non-Christian thing to do. Don't you think, Donna?
Yes, I really do. I've never seen anything like that.
But again, a good seance, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. Hey, we have to have fun with this.
Yeah.
Dan, any final questions on your end?
The only thing I had was a question about just reminding us, Professor Seger and Professor Baker, kind of your newest books, what you had mentioned at the beginning of the talk. We had someone who I think came in later and had missed the name of your new book, Professor Seger and yours, Professor Baker.
Well, thank you, Dan. My book, which I think is coming out next week, but I'm not really sure, but soon, very, very soon, is called The Practical Renaissance. And it is about how-to culture in 16th and 17th century England. Oh, good, because I forgot the subtitle, Information Culture and the Quest for Knowledge in Early Modern England. And Ted has so many books that we'd be here forever with all of his titles. But
Don't worry about it. But the focus is on Donna tonight because I am so thrilled to see this book coming out. I know
But you should pop up a great Storm of Witchcraft, and his new book, which you can see a lot of, he's working towards, is going to be on material culture in the 17th century.
Yeah, it's going to be a focus on largely from the perspective of Northern New England. And some degrees I see it maybe as sort of an opposite anchor to Edward Cook, the Ned Cook's book, which came out on Boston material culture recently, 1690 to 1720. And I want to show the perspective from the northern frontier is kind of my thinking. But you know, it's only a book I've been working on for about 20 years. And every time I start working on it, I get interrupted by another witchcraft book. So we'll try not to this time.
We should announce that our entire department, including Ted and myself, are working on an anniversary book for Salem's 400th. So we're going to have a collection of essays about all different aspects of
so come back in 2026 and but thanks for asking about the books.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
And that's, you know, I think that's a good place. We thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but this is the time that we're at. I'll forward all those questions, like, so that they can maybe be answered at a later date, and so they can be seen. But many thanks to Dr. Baker and Dr. Seger for gracing us with their presence in that. That was extremely informative, and we really appreciate it. If you didn't get a chance to see the whole thing, or if you know somebody who couldn't attend, we will put this up on the website. So this talk has been recorded and it will be available. If you're interested in other talks that we will have in the future, you can go on our website, charterstreetcemetery.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Charter Street Cemetery. We have an Instagram as of a few hours ago. We've got about four followers right now. I'd love to see that doubled by the end of the week. Charter Street Cemetery. But until then, thank you so very much, Dr. Baker and Dr. Seger, and to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank all of you.
It's a pleasure.
Cheers. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.